So we have a question about specifically what the title refers to, and it's a provocative question, is when you say, we'll always have been against this, the question I'm asking is, do you mean the genocide in Gaza, or do you mean Israel's treatment of Palestinians since 1948, which is to say Israel's existence since 1948?
I think it's very difficult for me to sort of treat those as two separate entities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, one day I used to live in Qatar, this tiny peninsula sticking out of Saudi Arabia, right? And the my dad used to work at what was then the only hotel in town, and we used to play tag. We would run around the floors of the hotel playing tag, and it was a sort of triangular hotel. In the corners were the suites. Um, and I'm running the corner one day, and I turn the corner and I bump into this guy and I fall on the ground and I look up, and it's this soldier. And in Qatar is one of the safest places on earth as long as you're not part of the migrant laborer class. Once you move up into the middle and up, it's like the safest, easiest lifestyle you will ever have. You never see soldiers. You certainly never see Qatari soldiers. Um, and it's this guy who was, at the time he looked like a grown man, but I'm sure he was like 18 or something. And he's holding this submachine gun and he's looking down at me. And the funny thing about it is that he looked terrified. He's standing in front of this little kid and he looked like he was gonna wet himself. Like I've never, and I had no idea what the hell was going on. And so, I scramble out of there, obviously. And I asked my dad afterwards, and it turned out that it wasn't even like an Israeli embassy. It was the opening of the Israeli trade delegation office or something. And they put it in this corner of the hotel because it was the first time that anything like this had happened, obviously, in a place like Qatar. And they put two soldiers in front of there, and the soldiers were obviously terrified. And inside it was like two Filipino secretaries, I think. It was just the whole thing was so ludicrous, but it sort of spoke to this idea that where does your narrative begin, right? Um, I can't I can't separate what is happening now from what has been happening for decades any more than I can separate the opening of this relatively meaningless trade delegation office from what came before. There wouldn't be those two soldiers standing there if there wasn't a before. And this isn't just, I mean, this is a pretty easy thing to say in terms of the sweep of history, but this goes in the other direction as well, right? Like I can't separate this from what is certainly coming next,
Mm-hmm.
right? From these thousands and thousands of folks who have had to bury what's left of their kids,
Mm-hmm.
or from the thousands of kids who are now orphaned, and the kind of rage they are going to feel going forward, and how many of these moments we are going to have that are not only going to be miserably violent and awful, but are also going to represent, for anybody who wants one, a new starting point of the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if that's what you're interested in, that's fully available to you.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many narrative starting points that can allow you to maintain a position on this issue that is not only completely at odds with what I think politically, but whatever you need to feel internally. And I try my best not to subscribe to that notion that we can reset history at certain points and operate independent of the context of whatever came before. I think it just, whatever short-term convenience it affords is more than offset by what you have to sort of, the cognitive dissonance that you then have to take on in order to maintain that position.
I want to offer a couple of quotes from the book and ask you to comment on them. But one more thing you just said in your first answer, I just wanted to come back to, because I do think it seems to me connected to the idea, to some of the themes in the book, which is you talked about the fact that you had been having trouble, that you were consumed by these images, and that it gave you some hope to see that there were people in positions of some privilege or potential privilege on college campuses who were also, who are also responding to them. And yet, obviously, many people, maybe most people, don't really particularly. And I'm just curious if you thought a little bit about what it is, why it is that you couldn't get these images out of your head, how much of it is just because of the accident of the fact that you come from the Arab world, and why you think it is that these college students, some of them, weren't able to get these things out of their head when obviously so many people are able to get them out of their head, including perhaps the people who are actually sending the weapons to begin with.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And I think it's a difficult one because, or at least I don't know that I have a good answer for you because the starting point is a kind of irreversible change on my part that I genuinely don't know how to go about explaining. Um, I think everybody has moments in their lives where they can say, I was one kind of person on one side of this, and I'm another person on the other side of it. And for me, most recently, it was the audio of Hind Rajab begging for her life before the soldiers shot the car she was in at least 355 times. And I don't, you know, I'm not going around trying to convince anybody to feel the same way I did on the other side of that. I don't, it doesn't matter to me, right? All I know is that I'm a different human being on the other side of that. And maybe it's she's Arab and I'm Arab. I don't know. I have no idea. I don't want to know. I don't want to test that theory. I did the book came out in the UK and Ireland before it came out in North America. So that was the first leg of the book tour. And that was really nice because no matter how much I screwed up all my media interviews, I could then leave and sort of leave the mess for my British publisher to deal with. Um, but it was, so my first interviews happened in the UK, and one of the earliest ones ended up being with this reporter who was a very hardcore Zionist. And so, it was a deeply unpleasant 45 minutes, but we're human beings. And I have this very naive belief that no matter um, whatever our opinions, I'll find something. I'll find some form of human connection if it's the two of us sitting in the room. And so we're talking, and it occurs to me after a while that so many of the questions seem to boil down to this notion of, oh, you don't want these people to be slaughtered? Well, who do you want to be slaughtered then? Like this idea that this is a binary. You're either stepping on the neck or you're having your neck stepped on. And if you believe in that kind of worldview, again, A, I'm not going to convince you otherwise, but B, a lot of this makes sense then, right? Um, I don't know. Not only can I not answer the question, and this is more troubling for me is that I can't answer the inverse question either, which is that like, why is it that so many people can see these images and shrug them off? Like, that to me is just as baffling. I can't tell you, I can't explain that, the other day or last week, I can't even tell anymore. I saw an image of a girl split in half, right? Like a baby girl split in half in the rubble and her sibling crying out. Is it because they're Arab and I'm Arab that I'm having this reaction? If that was an Israeli kid split in half, would I not have that reaction? And if so, is that not just like the plainest admission of monstrousness? I honestly I can't pontificate on it. I can only tell you that there is nothing that can be said about me. There is no allegation. There is no amount of antagonism that is going to get me to become the kind of human being to shrug this stuff off. I just don't care. You hate Israel, you hate Jews, you love Hamas, you like all of that stuff. And I'm a guy who loves to be liked and is deeply insecure and all of that good stuff. And in this situation, it's just it doesn't matter to me in the slightest. I can't live with being the kind of human being who looks at something like this by the tens of thousands and then says, well, there's probably a good reason. or this needs to happen, or well, time to move on. I just can't.
Yeah.